We are Myth Vision. Welcome back to Myth Vision Podcast. I'm your host, Derek Lambert. You know, I was a Christian for most of my life. I had experience after experience. And this is why in my last video that I did pertaining to William Lane Craig, and he talks about the assurance of salvation, the experience that one is confident to know that their sins are forgiven and that they are going to heaven and being with God for all eternity. They have some experience. And when he explains it, it sounds a lot like what the Mormons say. It sounds a lot like what all the religious experiences sound like. But of course, Craig is right. Everyone else is wrong. Now, I say that to say I have had countless experiences while in my religious upbringing in Christianity. And I thought God's presence was with me. Many times I thought he's right here with me. And I felt like this was true. It was only as time went by and I was somehow through my deconversion process willing to examine my own position. And along the way with my addiction to drugs, did I start to internalize and realize, is there a scientific explanation that makes better sense than the supernatural explanation? Today, I have a special guest. And with that, I will introduce Dr. John Wathy. Welcome to Myth Vision.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
I'm excited. I know your presentation today is going to blow the minds of many. And there's probably things you added to it since the last time your presentation that you sent me. I don't know. I'll just follow you on that. I want to let everybody know your nickname is Jack. I put Jack on the thumbnail. Jack, John, either way, Dr. Wathy, I really appreciate your time. You blew my mind with that presentation, and I know you're going to continue to do so for others. So thank you for giving us your time today.
Okay, great. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Let's do a plug here real quick. If you're interested in checking out his books, they are affordable. Go get The Illusion of God's Presence. I think, are we talking about this one specifically today?
Yes.
Excellent.
That's the subject for today.
Excellent. We do have one coming. And I'm telling you, you want to get the works. You're going to want to watch his other interviews. You're going to check this one out. I promise you, if you're watching now, you do not want to tune off. You're going to learn more than you've probably learned in a long time when it comes to this subject. The Illusion of God's Presence we're talking today. The Phantom God is what we're going to discuss in our next episode. So stay tuned. Make sure you go there in the description. The link is there. The books are in my recommended Myth Vision book list. Also, he has a website, wathyresearch.com. You can go down in the description. I believe it's down there. Should be down there, but wathyresearch.com, and there is plenty there to read up on. Consider joining our Patreon if you want true salvation, not the phantom kind, not the illusion kind, the real kind. And what is that? That is from the empirical observational approach to the world around us. We're not going to sell you bogus nonsense. We're here to give you the facts and let you draw conclusions. Help us out here at Myth Vision. We also have the mysteries, ancient Greek mystery cults. If you want to examine what the ancient Greek mystery cults were, early bird pricing right now, we have a course with Dr. M. David Litwa, who's an expert in this field. It is literally college level material. So just to give you an idea what the course looks like, there's a video. Each video is around 30 minutes long, 4K, high quality, extremely edited well, maps, everything to help you understand what the gods were, what they believed in their backstories and stuff. And the early bird pricing is still on. I also have a bunch of links down in the description for Bart Ehrman lectures I've done. The Genesis one really blew my mind. That's why I pulled that one up today. In the beginning, history, legend, or myth. There's so many interesting things on taking a critical approach to the Bible as to why this is a man-made document, not God-breathed, inerrant, infallible. Also, you become a member of Myth Vision and you get a special name tag next to your name, which makes you an elitist. Who doesn't want to be better than other people? Anyway, I'm playing. Consider joining the Myth Vision YouTube, and thank you everybody for showing up today. Dr. Wathy, if I can, do you want me to share your screen?
Yes, go right ahead. Give me just a second to click on a few things over here.
Yes, sir. And I will let everybody know while you're doing that, we will take your super chat Q&A at the end. You're probably going to have plenty of questions. This will be fascinating. And I'll mute myself during your presentation. So just
Okay,
let me know when.
great.
All right, you are
All right.
visible.
Great, go right in. That's fine. That's perfect. So I just want to say a quick thank you to Derek again for inviting me to this talk. It's an honor to be here with you. Illusions take up a lot of space. When they are gone, life flows in. I'm going to be covering a lot of scientific ground in this talk, but I hope you'll keep this quote in the back of your mind the whole time. It's kind of the main point of the whole talk. This beautiful thought comes from Dorothy Allred Solomon. It's from her memoir about growing up in a Mormon cult. What she's talking about here is her sister's metamorphosis after leaving the cult. But I think anyone who has broken free of religious thinking can identify with this. I certainly do. In my case, a big part of what flowed in was scientific thinking. I quit religion at about age 15, and I've never regretted it, but I have looked back. As a scientist, I couldn't help but wonder, why do we do this to ourselves? Why do all cultures have these strange beliefs? Why does religion have such a powerful grip on the human mind? Now, of course, many scientists have written about this, mostly anthropologists and psychologists. But I felt something important was being overlooked. That something is what I call the illusion of God's presence, and that's our subject for today. My talk will be in 4 parts. In part 1, I'll try to show through example what I mean by the illusion of God's presence. In part 2, I'll present some insights from the science of visual illusions that we'll need later in the talk. Now, you may wonder what any of this has to do with religion, but be patient. I think you'll see the relevance in part 3 when I try to explain the illusion of God's presence as something intrinsic to human nature. My hypothesis makes some testable predictions, and we'll turn to behavioral biology and neuroscience for some insights and evidence here. Now, of course, any good hypothesis should have explanatory power. So in part 4, I'll show how it explains 3 long-standing puzzles of religion, one of which was pointed out by Neil deGrasse Tyson. So that's the map of where we're going. Now let's move on to part 1. I said that the illusion of God's presence is something science has mostly overlooked. So to give you some context, I should first say at least a little bit about what science has studied about religion. Science has mostly explored those aspects that contribute to human social behavior. And of course, this is an extremely important dimension of religion. From it, we get things like belief in judgmental gods, greater cooperation within the in-group, greater hostility toward competing out-groups, rituals of sacrifice as proof of belief in loyalty, and group rituals that get believers moving and feeling as one. Now, in my book, I lump all of these things together into what I call the social root of religion. But the illusion of God's presence comes from somewhere else. In this painting, the artist depicts it in a visual way, because that's kind of what artists do. But it's really not a visual hallucination. It's more a compelling feeling that someone else is nearby, coupled with intense emotions. And I can best convey the illusion just by reading you some first-person accounts. They seem to fall into 2 big categories, one of which involves a feeling that comes on gradually and persists, possibly for a lifetime. Now, this may be just a vague sense that the universe is somehow mindful and benevolent, or an ongoing feeling of God's love and presence. Here's how blogger Andrew Sullivan describes it. I have never doubted the existence of God, never. My acceptance of God's existence, of a force beyond everything and the source of everything, goes so far back in my consciousness and memory that I can neither recall finding this faith nor being taught it. It is the air I have always breathed. And then there's the sudden and transient kind. Often these come in times of personal crisis or helplessness. This anonymous example comes from a collection of thousands of such reports. Then, just as I was exhausted and despairing, I had the most wonderful sense of the presence of God. He was in a particular place in the room, about 5 feet from me. I didn't look up, but kept my head in my hands and my eyes shut. It was a feeling of an all-embracing love, which called forth every ounce of love I had in me. It was the tenderest love I have ever encountered, and my sins were blotted out completely. So notice the strong emotions here and the spatial specificity of the illusion in a particular place at a specific distance. There's also typically an overwhelming feeling of knowing or sense of certainty that comes with these experiences. And this is so compelling that many people take it as evidence for God's existence. One of those is Christian apologist William Lane Craig. I know Christianity is true on the basis of the witness of the Holy Spirit in my heart. This gives me a self-authenticating means of knowing Christianity is true wholly apart from the evidence. Francis Collins, the director of NIH, makes a similar point with a rhetorical question. Why do we have a God-shaped vacuum in our hearts and minds unless it is meant to be filled? Now, some of you may notice that this is really just a plain old God of the gaps argument. We don't understand these feelings. Science could never explain this. Therefore, God did it. The problem with this is that it doesn't really explain anything. It's untestable. It suggests no experiments. It's an intellectual dead end. Now, I am not questioning the reality of the feelings. I've had those myself. But I just see them as a fascinating puzzle of human nature that cries out for a scientific explanation. We'll get to that in a few minutes, but first we need some insights from visual illusions. Illusions happen when a neural model differs from reality. In the Ames room illusion, the identical twins appear grossly different in size because the brain has an internal model of rectangular rooms with horizontal floors and parallel walls. Now, if you look into this room with both eyes, the illusion instantly vanishes because your depth perception reveals the true shape of the room, which is not rectangular. But as long as you look with only one eye, you see the illusion, even if you completely understand how it works. This is what psychologists call cognitive impenetrability. Our conscious understanding of the reality of the situation is not enough to penetrate the illusion. This illusion comes from a different neural model. Is this a meaningful image or just some random blobs and squiggles? Most of you will probably see only randomness here, but that's an illusion. The image as a whole really does have meaning, surprising and vivid meaning. But you could stare at it for hours and probably never see it, unless I do this. And for some of you, it will help if I make the image smaller, so I'll do that too. Now, I'm going to give you a few seconds to stare at this and think about it. Just see if you can identify anything meaningful in here. This is kind of an all or nothing experience. Either you can't make sense of it or it just vividly snaps into your mind and you see it in a compelling way. And I'm assuming by now that some of you have detected that there's a face in this image. And for those of you who haven't, I'm going to give you a few hints. And let me move my cursor over here to the image. This is the image of a woman's face in profile. She's looking to the right. And this is her eyebrow right here. And down here below it is the eye. This is the outline of her nose, which is mostly in shadow. Her mouth is open in a vivid smile. And these are her lips right here. This is her chin, and her neck is there. So I'm hoping that that has made this visible for most of you. This thing is called a Mooney face after psychologist Craig Mooney, who used images like these to study perception in the 1950s. It's a grossly impoverished image, stripped of all color, shades of gray, and most spatial detail. Now, when I had it upside down, I was making reality differ from your neural model of a face, which evidently expects faces to be upright. And even now that most of you can see the face, you'll probably lose that percept, or at least it will become much weaker if I turn it upside down again. And there are two important lessons here. One is that this is yet another example of cognitive impenetrability. We have trouble seeing the face in this image if it's upside down, even when we know it's there. But if we turn it right side up, our neural model fleshes out this stripped down picture, and we get a much more vivid percept of a face. And that's the second lesson. Perception comes not only from sensory input, but also from what the brain expects. And when the sensory input is impoverished, the expectations of the brain's internal models become much more important. Now, of course, if the image is not impoverished, it's easy to see upside down faces, and many of you will recognize this as Margaret Thatcher. Now, if you study these images carefully, you'll see some slight differences, but overall, they give the impression of being very similar, almost identical, and that is the illusion. Here's what they really look like. The only difference here is that the eyes and the mouth have been turned upside down in this image on the left, but that's enough to make her a hideous ghoul. And because Margaret Thatcher's face was the first one to be abused in this way, the illusion is named in her honor. What this tells us is that there's a special purpose circuit in the brain for the holistic processing of upright faces. And our perception of the normality of a face and its emotional impact are absolutely dependent on that circuit. We are utterly blind to the ghoulishness of Margaret Thatcher's altered face if it's upside down. What the illusion cannot tell us, though, is whether that special purpose circuit is innately specified or is the product of experience. After all, we almost never see upside down faces. Maybe the brain is lousy at perceiving them because it just hasn't seen enough of them. So is holistic face perception innate or learned? Well, it turns out there's a way we can find out. Twin studies are the gold standard for teasing apart innate versus learned aspects of perception. Identical twins share 100% of their genes, but fraternal twins only 50% on average. So if identical twins are significantly more alike in their face perception abilities than our fraternal twins, then that's compelling evidence of a genetic contribution. Now, to be able to do a twin study like this, we need tests of face perception that give us numbers, and luckily there are some. I don't have time to explain these, but all you really need to know is that these are sensitive tests of holistic face perception that give numerical scores. The twin study found a strong genetic contribution to holistic face perception. About a third of the variance across individuals comes from genetic factors. We even know where this circuit is in the brain because damage to the fusiform gyrus, shown here in red, causes profound face blindness or prosopagnosia. And it's not the whole area in red here that matters for face processing. If you damage just these two little red spots called the fusiform face area, that's enough to give you face blindness. Now, it's a little misleading to call it face blindness because people who have it can still tell you they're seeing a face if you show them a picture of a face. But what they cannot do is tell you whose face it is, even if it's a famous person or a close family member. Also, the deficit is permanent. No other part of the brain can learn to take over the role of a damaged fusiform face area. The astonishing thing, though, is that the face blindness is permanent, even if the damage happens in a one-day-old infant. This paper I'm citing here describes a teenage boy who suffered a stroke that destroyed the fusiform face area when he was 1 day old. He had profound and permanent face blindness, but his recognition of non-face objects was more or less normal, and that's fairly typical of this face blindness syndrome. But what's astonishing about this case is that infancy is the time when the brain is most plastic, when the function lost to local damage can often be taken over by some other area of cortex, but not if the damage is in the fusiform face area. What this means is that the fusiform face area is an extremely brittle, single-purpose, innately specified circuit for which no other part of the brain can substitute. Despite the fact that this thing is a learning machine. The whole purpose of the fusiform face area is to learn to recognize thousands of individual faces over the course of a person's lifetime. So it's not like there's no synaptic plasticity going on in this thing. It's extremely plastic. All it does is learning. That's what it's for. But it's a highly specialized kind of learning, and that's the point I'm trying to get across here. Highly specialized learning of this kind requires a foundation of innate knowledge. And that insight suggests an interesting question. Can a newborn infant use any of this innate knowledge about faces? Well, it turns out that they can and do. Newborn infants have some holistic face perception ability. They spend more time looking at an upright Mooney face than one that's upside down. Also, they prefer a Mooney face to a similar non-face image. And we know from a clever habituation test that they see these two images as the same, but they see these two as different. So the human brain expects to see faces. That expectation is partly innate, and it's up and running at birth. This neural expectation makes us extremely sensitive to faces, and that's normally a good thing. We need that sensitivity to see the mood and intention in the faces of other people, for example. And even newborn infants may have some rudimentary ability to do that. The evidence for this comes from studies of neonatal imitation, like the one shown here. Under the right conditions, a newborn will spontaneously imitate the face of an adult model. Now, I need to point out that this is a subtle phenomenon. It takes careful observation and statistics to demonstrate it. And although it has been widely replicated, there is still some controversy about it in the scientific literature. But overall, the evidence is overwhelming that newborns are highly sensitive to faces, and adults, of course, extremely so. In fact, our face expectant cortex is so sensitive that it sometimes makes us see faces that aren't there at all. And I'm sure you've all had that experience. We see faces in the clouds, in trees, rocks, shadows. We can see faces almost anywhere. Here's one of my favorite examples. This is the famous face on Mars, photographed by the Viking 1 orbiter in 1976. Now, the little black dots here are data dropouts. They're not real. But one of them just happened to fall in the right place to make a compelling nostril. And that accident, along with the way the shadows happened to fall, made this otherwise unremarkable mesa look enough like a face that our fusiform face area instantly sees it that way. And here's another image of the same mesa seen years later by the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter using a much higher resolution camera. Now, I've deliberately blurred the image here to give it about the same low resolution as in the previous image, which you can still see down in the corner on the right. Now, of course, in this new image, the accidental nostril is gone and the shadows are different. But if you try hard, you might still be able to see a face in this, especially if you use the old image as a hint. But if we get rid of the blurring and go to high resolution, then it becomes obvious that this face exists only in our brains and not on Mars. So let's quickly go over the main points I'd like you to remember about illusions. Perception comes not only from sensory input, but also from what the brain expects. The brain takes shortcuts in its internal models to improve performance at critical perceptual tasks. And one of those shortcuts is, for example, the assumption that faces will be upright. Illusions happen when a neural model differs from reality, and it may be a shortcut in the model that makes it differ from reality. Learning often requires a foundation of innate knowledge, as we saw in the fusiform face area. Twin studies are the gold standard for teasing apart innate versus learned aspects of perception and behavior. And finally, the brain's expectations can make us perceive things that aren't there at all, like the illusory face on Mars. Now we can turn to the illusion of God's presence and my explanation of it. What exactly is this? What aspect of reality is the brain trying to model here? What causes the illusion? And how does it compare to the visual illusions we were just looking at? When I try to explain this in terms of biology and evolution, I sometimes get the objection that religion comes entirely from indoctrination, so my hypothesis must be wrong. Let's get this out of the way first. There are two lines of evidence that biology is partly a biological thing. One is the observation from anthropology that religion is a cultural universal, and the other comes from twin studies, our gold standard, which find that religiousness is significantly heritable. Roughly half the variance in religiousness across individuals comes from genetic factors. But if religion is partly a product of evolution, then why would natural selection favor this? Well, my short answer is that it doesn't. It favors something else that makes us vulnerable to this illusion. I think there's a completely natural explanation for the illusion of God's presence, one that has to do with the peculiar constraints of human infancy. I think the neonatal brain is expecting something godlike, but that something isn't God. And we can see a hint of what it really is expecting in the Moreau reflex. This is an infantile startle reflex. It's thought to be a vestige of our primate ancestors. As infants, they would cling to their mother's fur, and whenever they were jostled or startled, they had to reflexively reach out and grab on tight. I think you'll agree it bears a striking resemblance to Pentecostal prayer. This is just one of many examples of what I call the infantile or neonatal root of religion, which I believe explains the illusion of God's presence. In contrast to the social root, the neonatal root of religion is characterized by belief in a God of unconditional love, maternal compassion and caring, infantilism in religious feeling and ritual, intense spiritual longing, and the illusion of God's presence. This kind of religiousness appears to be a byproduct of selective pressures for the survival of helpless infants. And I formalize this idea as a hypothesis that has three parts. Part one is that a newborn infant has an innate neural model of its mother. Now, this is not a detailed image of a specific person, but only a sense of the existence of some vague and amorphous primordial savior out there somewhere. And here are the essential elements of this model as I conceive it. A newborn infant knows that its mother exists, that she knows how to help the infant, that she's able to help, wants to help, and will help when she hears crying. Now, there's a bit more to it than that. There's also some physiologically critical information about the mother providing nourishment through nipples that can be recognized by scent and touch and taste, about her having a melodic voice, a feminine pitch, and about her having a face and some rough idea of what a face is and what it looks like. And on the left here, you can see what a mother's face does look like to a newborn, with its still developing visual system. This is an impoverished image, sort of like what we just saw in a Mooney face. So you can see how it would be helpful for infants to have some innate capacity for holistic face processing. Well, I am suggesting they have more than that, especially in the cortex that will ultimately support social behavior in adulthood. But in infancy, it supports attachment to mom, the primordial savior. So that's part one of the hypothesis. Part two is that the circuitry that implements this innate model of the mother persists into adulthood, but normally lies dormant. And part three is that the existence of this circuitry in the adult can give rise to the illusory feeling of a loving presence, especially though not necessarily, under conditions that mimic the helplessness of infancy. These feelings are often interpreted in religious terms because a crude mother-shaped vacuum is easily misperceived as a God-shaped vacuum. This hypothesis is consistent with what we know about the newborns and hatchlings of many vertebrate species. Having some kind of innate knowledge is the rule, not the exception. A good example are the herring gull chicks studied by Nico Tinbergen. They have an innate visual model of the parent's head and bill, especially that prominent red spot near the tip. They peck at that spot to solicit feeding, and newly hatched chicks will do this without any prior experience. Tinbergen found that the chicks would also peck at artificial models of the bill, and if he exaggerated thinness, redness, and contrast near the tip, he could make a stimulus that was even more effective than the natural one. This is a classic example of what ethologists call a supernormal stimulus. In much the same way, I am suggesting that God is a supernormal stimulus for the innate neural model of mother. God is a kind of superparent who answers prayers, is perfectly loving, omnipotent, and omniscient. These exaggerated attributes excite that crude model of a mother even better than a real mother does. And when it's excited, the innate certainty of the mother's existence feeds the certainty of God's existence and the illusion of his or her sensed presence. Another useful metaphor here is the illusory phantom limb of the amputee. The phantom limb happens because the brain of an amputee expects the missing limb to be there, and that neural expectation creates the illusion. The patient's conscious knowledge that it's an illusion doesn't make it go away. I really like this metaphor because if you combine it with the previous one, you get a nice, catchy phrase. In the light of biology, the God of unconditional love is a supernormal phantom, not a supernatural spirit. God is a supernormal stimulus in the ethological sense to the innate model of mother, and God's presence is a phantom sensation in the neurological sense, because the innate model expects a primordial savior to be there, just as the brain of the amputee expects the missing limb to be there. And this similarity of the phantom limb and the sensed presence is more than just a metaphor. Both the phantom limb and the sensed presence are illusions of embodiment, one's own in the case of a phantom limb, or someone else's in the case of a sensed presence. There's an interesting part of the brain called the temporoparietal junction that's involved in both of these illusions. I think this is likely to be one of several places in the brain where the innate model of mother is implemented, but it's not the whole thing. If you stimulate this area with electric current, the subject may experience the illusion of a sensed presence, though seldom with any kind of religious interpretation. The spatial and the personal aspects of it are there, but the divine love usually is not. Those feelings of divine love may, however, come from this place. This is the orbitofrontal cortex, which I think is also likely to be an essential part of the innate model of mother. It's on the underside of the frontal lobes just above the eyes. Now, of course, it's what the orbitofrontal cortex does that makes it interesting. In monkeys, we know it's important for reinforcement learning. Neurons in the orbitofrontal cortex learn to become excited by a previously neutral stimulus, like, for example, a green triangle on a computer screen. But that only happens if the triangle is paired with a tasty treat. The tasty treat is called a primary reinforcer because it is innately rewarding, and the triangle becomes a secondary reinforcer only with learning. And by the way, the encoding of primary reinforcers in this part of the brain appears to be yet another example where innate knowledge is an essential foundation for learning. Now, we also know from neural imaging experiments that the orbitofrontal cortex is specifically activated in human parents when they see infants. and in infants when they hear their mother's voice. Now, of course, it's this last finding and others similar to it that are most relevant to my hypothesis of the innate model of the mother. But all three of these things together strongly suggest that the innate model of the mother, or at least the part of it that's in orbitofrontal cortex, can be thought of as the set of primary reinforcers needed for learning human social behavior. This could explain why the innate model persists into adulthood. It persists because it's an innate foundation for learning. Primary reinforcers like gentle touch, a smiling face, an affectionate tone of voice, all of these are innately rewarding and drive us to connect with others, not only in infancy, but throughout life. Now, the most compelling evidence for this is that damage to the orbitofrontal cortex in humans causes acquired sociopathy. Now, in this syndrome, cognitive abilities are normal. Things like memory, language, math skills, logical reasoning, all of that stuff is fine. The problem is these patients can't feel the emotional consequences of reward and punishment. They lack gut feelings. Also, they can't anticipate how their actions affect others, so they are devoid of empathy. And because of these deficits, they make terrible decisions, though not usually rising to the level of criminality. But, for example, they lose their jobs, they make stupid investments, they go bankrupt, they get divorced, they marry prostitutes. In short, their lives fall apart. Interestingly, though, this syndrome is most severe when the damage occurs in infancy. As children, these patients are disruptive and impulsive in school. They're always getting in trouble for pathological lying, aggression, and stealing. They have poor hygiene and bizarre diets. They practice careless sex starting in their early teen years, and they make dangerously negligent parents. What this tells us is that the orbitofrontal cortex is an extremely brittle, innately specified circuit for which no other part of the brain can substitute. Well, this should sound a little familiar. We have seen this movie before. This is just the kind of thing we saw in the fusiform face area. And like the fusiform face area, this innately specified thing is a learning machine. Well, this is all very fascinating and says a lot about my hypothetical innate model of the mother. But does the orbitofrontal cortex have anything to do with feeling God's presence? It should, if my hypothesis is right. But unfortunately, that's kind of a difficult experiment to do. Ideally, you'd like to scan the brains of people in that critical moment when they're having the sudden and intense kind of feeling of God's presence. But that's a little hard to summon on demand. And yet, if there's anyone who could do it or come close to doing it, it would surely be these people, the Carmelite nuns of Montreal. They spend much of their time seeking closeness to God. And this image here comes from their website, where it had the caption, "God lives, I stand in his presence." Well, luckily, Montreal also has some neuroscientists, and two of them persuaded 15 Carmelite nuns to be subjects in a brain scanning experiment. Their neural activity in a mystical state was compared to that in a baseline condition, resting with their eyes closed. Now, in the mystical condition, the subjects were asked to remember and relive with their eyes closed the most intense mystical experience ever felt in their lives as members of the Carmelite order. And to give you some clue about what kind of mystical experience we're talking about here, I'd like to read you a direct quote from the paper. During the qualitative interviews conducted at the end of the experiment, several subjects mentioned that during the mystical condition, they felt the presence of God, his unconditional and infinite love, as well as plenitude and peace. Well, that's pretty good. That sounds a lot like what we're interested in. So, what was happening in the brain during all of this? The paper listed 14 brain areas specifically active in the mystical condition relative to baseline. but I will just show you the top 5. And at the very top of the list, the most active is the orbitofrontal cortex. So that's encouraging. Now, I don't have a specific interpretation for the next one, the middle temporal area. But the last 3 in the list here, the inferior and superior parietal lobules, are either in or near the temporoparietal junction. That's the area that handles embodiment, where direct stimulation can sometimes elicit the illusion of a sensed presence. Now, I want to stress that all of this is merely suggestive. It does not prove my hypothesis, but it is at least consistent with it. Okay, let's go over the main points from this part of the talk. Religion is partly a biological thing. There's a neonatal root of religion that science has largely overlooked. God's presence is an illusion in high-order association cortex that retains an innate model of mother. In the light of ethology and neuroscience, God is a supernormal phantom, not a supernatural spirit. And finally, the hypothesis of the innate model of mother leads to testable predictions. We saw evidence for one of them in the orbitofrontal cortex. Now, a good hypothesis may also explain some long-standing puzzles, and we have time to look at 3. Puzzle number 1. Why is God two-faced? Why do believers tell you their God will damn you to hell, yet in the same breath insist that he loves you unconditionally? Well, you probably already know my answer. They are blind to this blatant contradiction because of powerful intuitions from the social and neonatal roots of religion, which tell them that both descriptions of God must be true. Now, if I'm right about this, if these really are the dominant sources of religious emotion, then the insight applies to more than just the two-faced God. It means that religion is in some fundamental sense two-dimensional. If we mix the social and neonatal ingredients in the right proportions, we should be able to cook up just about any kind of religiousness there is. Or more precisely, if we could measure how much a person's belief comes from the social and neonatal components, then we could plot anyone in this space. Now, in my book, I include a rough draft of a psychometric test that tries to do exactly that. The latest version has 44 items that assess the 10 qualities in these 2 lists. Each item is a statement that probes one of these aspects of religiousness, and respondents indicate their level of agreement. And for a statement like this one, teachers should lead prayer in public schools. The standard way of indicating level of agreement works just fine. And I'm sure you've all seen tests like this, where you indicate on a scale how much you agree with the statement. But what about this one? God will never abandon me. The statement assumes that God exists and probes absolute trust in that God. So for an atheist like me, this is kind of confusing. If I say I disagree, I seem to be saying, okay, there is a God, but I just don't trust him. It's almost like being asked, have you stopped beating your wife? So to avoid this kind of confusion, I include one more option for those who feel the statement just doesn't apply to them. Okay, so now you've seen what the items look like, but I'd like to show you just a few more to give you a feel for what's really being measured in this test. Let's start with the social dimension, and we'll take a look at some items that probe divine judgment. For example, God rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked. Hell is a real place where sinners and unbelievers are punished. At times I have been fearful of God's wrath. In probing sacrifice, we get things like people who don't contribute money at religious services should stop coming. I would gladly give my life to defend my faith. And I would rather my child die than lose his or her faith in God. Now, the first one in this list seems pretty tame compared to the other 2. And the last one is so extreme, you might think that no parent could possibly feel that way. But I assure you, there are some who do. That's an almost verbatim quote from a Christian mother. Now, as you might imagine, on the neonatal side, things look rather different. Probing infantilism. I sometimes think of God more as a loving mother than as a heavenly father. I feel safe in God's arms. We are all God's children. And probing the feeling of God's presence, we get things like, God lives in my heart. God always answers my prayers. I know God is real because I have felt his presence. Okay, so that should give you a pretty good idea of what this psychometric test is all about. But the main point I want to make is that you should think of it as a prediction. These two dimensions of religiousness should really exist, not just on paper, but in the minds of the people who take the tests. Now, psychologists have a mathematical tool for getting at this kind of problem. It's called factor analysis. So I am predicting that if my psychometric tests were to be given to many subjects of diverse religious backgrounds, then the social and neonatal items should naturally segregate into these two distinct factors in a factor analysis. That would mean that they correspond to something real in the minds and brains of the people who are taking the test. Now, that experiment hasn't been done, but it should be. Okay, let's move on to puzzle number 2. Why are women more religious than men? This is probably the single most robust finding in the psychology of religion. Across nearly all religions and by most measures of religiousness, women are significantly more religious than men on average. Now, of course, we're only talking about averages here. There are many free-thinking women and there are many religious men, but on average, this holds up pretty well. The only significant exception to it, really, is in the frequency of attending worship services, where the gender gap is kind of a mixed picture. These data I'm showing you come from the Pew Research Center. And shown in orange are the 30 countries in which significantly more women than men attend weekly religious services. In blue are the 28 countries in which men predominate. In gray are the countries with no significant gender gap, and countries in white were not surveyed for this question. Now, it turns out that what's going on here is that in predominantly Muslim countries, a social norm requires men to attend Friday prayers in the mosque. Women, however, are allowed to pray in private, and they often do so at home. But for every other measure of religiousness included in the Pew surveys, the maps are overwhelmingly orange and gray. Here, for example, is the map of self-rated importance of religion in the subjects' personal lives. Women predominate in 36 countries and men in only 2, Israel and Mozambique. Here's the map for daily prayer. Women predominate in 43 countries, and there's only one tiny speck of blue on the map, which is Israel. And finally, here's the map for religious affiliation. Women predominate in 61 countries, and there is not a single speck of blue on the map. So why is this? Why are women more religious than men? Well, several explanations have been offered, and a few have some supporting evidence, but there's no scientific consensus on this question. I happen to think there are several factors behind this gender gap, but the idea of the innate model of the mother suggests a new one that I think may be especially important because it makes some interesting predictions. I call it the crosstalk hypothesis for the greater religiousness of women, and it comes from something I showed you earlier in the orbitofrontal cortex. You may remember that both adult caring for infants and infantile longing for mother come from the same neural circuitry. This strongly suggests that these two behavioral systems are correlated. There's crosstalk between them. Individuals with greater empathetic caring as adults should, as infants, have greater infantile longing for mother, and as adults, greater spiritual longing for God, because I hypothesize that both of those kinds of longing come from the same neural circuitry. But there's one more critical piece to this puzzle, and that is the observation that women are significantly more caring and nurturing than men. This means that they should have greater spiritual longing than men, which makes them more susceptible to the illusion of God's presence, and therefore more religious than men in the neonatal dimension. And I emphasize that last part because it's important. It makes specific predictions about what kind of religiousness we should find in women relative to men. For example, veneration of God as an infant should have a relatively greater appeal for women than for men. On average, women will score higher on the neonatal dimension relative to the social than men. And greater nurturance or empathetic caring as a personality trait should correlate with greater religiousness of the neonatal kind, independent of gender. And I think we can see a good example of this in Francis Collins. He became a Christian early in his career as a physician caring for cancer patients. It was his great compassion, not the infamous frozen waterfall, that brought him to Jesus. And that brings us to puzzle number 3. Why do elite scientists believe in God? Years ago, Neil deGrasse Tyson pointed to this puzzle and said there's something else going on, something nobody seems to be talking about, something mysterious and alluring that religion can, something mysterious and alluring about religion that can seduce even the most brilliant of scientific minds. He cited these data from a paper in Nature. As of the late 1990s, about 90% of the American public believed in a personal God who answers prayer. For American scientists, however, that number is lower, only about 40%. But when you look at elite scientists, members of the National Academy of Sciences, 93% of them reject belief in a personal God. That was the message of the paper. But Neil's point was that the authors had missed the most exciting and puzzling thing in their data. Namely, why isn't this number 0? Religiosity drops off. Excuse me just a second. Somehow my slides have changed radically. Hang on.
No worries, no worries. Just so everybody knows, we're getting there. We're almost toward the end. Feel free to super chat your questions if you'd like.
Let me see if I can get back here. It seems to have stopped sharing my screen somehow.
I see your screen. I just don't see the PowerPoint.
Okay, hang on just a second. Let me see what's going on over here in PowerPoint. Sorry about this, folks.
Oh, you're fine.
Let's see. I'm going to stop sharing and start sharing again.
Start it again. Absolutely. I appreciate the support, everybody who's already shown it. This is a fascinating topic, and I look forward to seeing where Q&A goes because there's all sorts of stuff to uncover and kind of pick at.
Okay, now we're just about there. Somehow maybe it's this might be a hardware problem with my second screen. Hang on here. Let's see. We're so close to being done too. Let's see. Okay, is that looking better on your end yet?
You haven't shared the screen yet.
Okay, hang on. Let me come back to there and hit share.
There you go. Got it.
Okay, fantastic. Sorry about that. I don't know what happened. Everything just disappeared all of a sudden. Must be some spirit infiltrating my computer. Okay, so we were talking about Neil deGrasse Tyson's challenge, and he pointed out that we have this strange thing that when you look at elite religious scientists, 93% of them reject belief in a personal God. And Neil's point was, no, actually the point of the paper, let's see. I'm having trouble now advancing the slides.
We see the my predictions for the mysterious 7%. That's where we're at.
Okay. Oh, hang on. I do know what the problem is. We need to get back over here. Okay. All right. Sorry, folks. Here we go. Okay. So what Neil was pointing out that was that, okay, we're at predictions. So I want to back up just a little bit. I've gone just a little bit too far. Yeah, I've gone a few slides too far. Hang on. Okay, here we are. So what Neil deGrasse Tyson pointed out about this is that the amazing thing is not that 93% of NAS members don't believe in God. The amazing thing is that this number isn't zero. Why do 7% of the most elite and brilliant scientific minds in the country believe in a personal God? Religiosity drops off with increasing scientific training, but it reaches this non-zero asymptote. And Neil went on to argue that if we really want to understand religion, these are the people we should be studying, not the general public. Whatever it is that can make believers out of these folks must be the most concentrated essence of the thing we're trying to understand. Now, one suggestion I've heard is that these 7% must have had heavy religious indoctrination as children, and so were more likely to believe in God as adults. Now, that particular idea was not tested in this study of the NAS members, but it was examined in a similar survey of the equally prestigious Royal Society of London. Regarding the 5% of fellows of the Royal Society who do believe in a personal God, the authors write, "We also found that, surprisingly, childhood religious upbringing was not significantly related to current attitudes toward religion." Well, this may have surprised the author, but it doesn't surprise me in the least. My answer, of course, is that this comes from the neonatal root of religion, and what's seducing these elite scientists is the cognitively impenetrable illusion of God's presence. And again, this makes testable predictions. Relative to the 93% of their colleagues who do not believe in God, this puzzling 7% of NAS members should be significantly enriched in women, physicians, and others who score high on tests of empathy and nurturance. Also, relative to those in the general public who do believe in God, the 7% should be significantly enriched to people who identify as spiritual but not religious, which is really just another way of saying that their faith comes mostly from the neonatal root. I'd like to close with one last description of the illusion of God's presence, this one experienced on the moon by astronaut Gene Cernan. We're now in a good position to make sense of it. I was literally standing on a plateau somewhere out there in space, a plateau that science and technology had allowed me to get to. But what I was feeling at that moment in time, science had no answers for. Because there I was, and there you are, the Earth, dynamic, overwhelming. And I felt that the world just had too much purpose, too much logic. It was just too beautiful to have happened by accident. There has to be somebody bigger than you and bigger than me. And I mean this in a spiritual sense, not a religious sense. There has to be a creator of the universe who stands above the religions that we ourselves create to govern our lives. Well, first of all, notice how he rejects the God of the social root, not a religious sense, above religions that govern our lives. Also, we can see and hear the God of the gaps, science has no answer, and the argument from design, too beautiful to have happened by accident. But I consider both of these mere conscious rationalizations of the powerful intuition that was really behind this experience. And here is that intuition, the certainty that there is somebody bigger. This, I suggest, comes from the innate model of mother. Science does have an answer for this. It hasn't yet been completely tested, but it explains a lot, and it is specific enough that it can be tested. You can learn more about all of this at my website, wathyresearch.com, and of course, even more in my book, The Illusion of God's Presence. Now, in this book, you'll see that I promise a sequel, a second book, that will explore in great detail the neuroscience of human religiousness. That book is coming out next month. It's called The Phantom God, and I hope to join you sometime between now and then to talk about it. And with that shameless plug, I'll be happy to take questions. And give me just a second, and I'll stop sharing the screen and try to get us back to normal.
Yes, I can't wait to interview you on that second book. For sure. Are we back?
Does the screen look okay to you?
Yeah,
okay,
we're back. Can you see me?
Yes, I can see you. If you can
Excellent.
see me, I think we're good.
Excellent. Yes. In fact, a lot of what you described in this presentation, like just my experience alone and my trying to be observant of my the things you describe about presence and experience and thinking in a natural way of trying to get at what's going on here. A lot of this stuff is like the words I've been trying to express, but didn't have the science to really say like what it was. But I already kind of had an intuition, if you will, that taking a natural approach, there is an explanation, and exactly how that is, what it is the difficult problem. It's like being able to express the things you described here about God and the presence of things, my experiences, because I honestly have felt it's like, there's a friend of mine who has a YouTube channel called Rationality Rules. He's an atheist. He's a philosopher type, he's autodidact. He's learned a lot in his research, and he, used the term narcissistic in the same sense that Sam Harris does towards William Lane Craig. And I feel that I relate to that kind of rhetoric, because it's almost like people like William Lane Craig or others act like I've never experienced the presence of God. All of the language that they use and describe, I know exactly what they're saying. I have experienced it. And the funny thing is, since becoming an atheist, I still experience these experiences. I don't need Jesus. Yeah. And it's like, you act like you have the monopoly on what this is. And no, it is a natural phenomenon that we have innate. So I just wanted to say that before we get into Q&A, that your presentation makes a lot of sense. You're not suggesting it's totally biological, that biology plays a significant role into religion. This also kind of gets to the root of, are we born theist or atheist? Mm-hmm. And for me, what you're describing here pushes us in the direction naturally to assume agency, even if it's not there. So yes, you don't have to say they're theists, but in a sense, there is this, we need a presence, or something needs to be there, unless maybe something has gone wrong in the birthing process, or a stroke, or something's happened, right, that maybe makes you less sensitive to these kind of natural phenomena.
Yes, exactly. Our brain is shaped such that even when we're born, we are born expecting other people to exist, and one very special other person in particular, on whom the infant's survival depends in the first critical days.
I also like how, when you were bringing up perception and visual, and how, blew my mind the first time I saw this, because I never really thought about the upside down images never making sense. Then when they were right side up, I automatically knew what they were, and how a child in its mother's womb genetically is able to see images and perceive or try to make out images properly. And if they're right side up, they pay attention to the ones that they can make out better than the blob that doesn't make sense. So before they're even born, this isn't a learned attribute, even though there is learning involved. It's innate. It's part of our biological makeup to try and make out facial recognition. And I
Yeah,
imagine, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to interject. One of the most dramatic examples of that, of the way the brain is shaped innately, can actually be detected in the brains of a fetus in the third trimester, close to birth, but not even born yet, where it's possible to detect what's called evoked potentials, or actually they use magnetic fields to do this. You can get better results with magnetic fields. You can measure neural activity in the speech cortex of a basically a premature infant or a fetus still in the womb, able to discriminate human speech phonemes. So their speech cortex is already prepared to make fine discriminations between subtly different human speech phonemes. So we have a language expectant cortex also.
One question I had before we dive into Q&A, for everybody, they're going to super chat their questions. We've already got some that are asking you. Is some Christian or atheist, whatever their religious preference may be, may try to say, so Dr. Wathi, this was an interesting presentation. It doesn't do anything to dissolve my religious faith. In fact, it reinforces the fact that I believe we're born. God has created us with the innate necessity to fill that that void of agency that's needed out there. It's almost like no matter what you bring to the table that can explain the natural processes, how something's a heightened sense, the pecking of the beak that has the red bill, create an artificial one, they peck that more than they do the actual bill of the mother itself that came natural. So what? We're built machines to believe, and that's because God made us that way. How would you, as a scientist, as an atheist, and one who has had many spiritual experiences in your life, who no longer attributes that to God, how would you explain something to someone like that?
Well, first of all, I have to point out that this is exactly the argument that Francis Collins makes in his book. It's one of his big pitches for why we should believe in God, or at least why he believes in God. He, incidentally, is one of those mysterious 7%. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences. He is a truly distinguished scientist. I'm in awe of him as a scientist. He's brilliant, truly. He deserves all the praise he gets for his accomplishments. But he's been tricked here by this cognitively impenetrable illusion, I think. That's my interpretation. What I would say to him, if I had the chance to talk with him, is first of all, he's going off the rails of the scientific method when he does this. Because to suggest that God shaped our brains this way so that we could have these experiences and commune with him, feel his presence, know his love, and so forth, does not explain anything in the way that scientists use the concept of to explain. For something to explain anything in science, the idea must make testable predictions. And there's no way to test this idea that God has given us an antenna to reach God. So that's the first point. And the second point is that this is really just a God of the gaps argument, as I said earlier during the talk, that we're basically just saying, I can't explain these feelings, therefore God did it. But the problem with that is we've been doing that for thousands of years. Anytime we find something like lightning and thunder that frightens us and we don't understand it, we invent a God to explain that. Again, putting the word explain in quotes, because it's not the scientific way. There are very few educated people today who will tell you that lightning and thunder come from Thor's hammer. Very few people still accept that. We have much better explanations for that really do make testable predictions. And they've been tested and they work really well. In fact, our understanding of electricity and magnetism, that's one of the main reasons you and I are talking through this device right now. It's made the modern world possible. So this has happened again and again and again. Every place the God of the gaps has occupied, he's been pushed out of there by the advancement of scientific knowledge. And one of the few places where the God of the gaps still seems able to hide is in things like human consciousness and in specific aspects of human consciousness. And this feeling of a loving presence is one of those. And what I would say is there are natural explanations for these kinds of things. I've offered one in this talk. It has not been thoroughly tested, but as I pointed out, it's specific enough it could be tested. And I think that's much more promising an explanation than just, oh, it's a magical antenna that God put there.
Right. I'm with you. And yes, 100%. Especially, I took a different route, right? So science was my last, like, what I've investigated. I mean, I'm not a scientist, right? So it was one of those things I started poking my head into, and I was like, oh, wow. But it was problems theologically, textually, things like that started making me go, this is incoherent, or it can't be logically both true. Something's false here and something's true, or both could be false. And so I started going that route and textually picking apart using critical scholarship on the Bible, right? But then I was looking at natural phenomena because of my addictions. And like, why did I have addiction? Like, why was I doing this? Was it a demon? Was it a ghost? Was I spiritually fallen? Like the church kept telling me. And then finally it was like, no, your frontal lobe cortex is not triggering sending the proper signals to the midbrain. And it was like all of these things that science started to explain. Next thing you know, guess who's almost 7 years off of heroin, October the 25th? Somebody who knows his situation, who understands himself, not as a fallen ape or a fallen man, if anything, a rising ape who's understanding his situation. And it's helped me realize I'm not a bad person, as these religions want to tell me, or this horrible individual. I had a sickness, an illness. I needed treatment. I needed medical attention. I needed help. I needed to talk to a psychiatrist. I needed to work this out. So I always like to put my experience in there for someone who might be suffering with addiction and struggling with life, to understand they're not alone, and you can do it without needing religion. If you have religion, I'm not here to knock you. I want you to survive no matter what. But these are fun topics. So let's get into the Q&A. Scott Daniel, as you can see, it pops up on the screen. Scott, thanks for being a patron and, of course, the super chat. Psychedelic use can generate a sense of transcendence by suppressing the brain's default mode network. How would you qualify that experience?
Okay. There's another, you may remember early in the talk, I made the point that one of the important aspects of the way perception works is that perception does not come only from sensory input, but it also comes from what the brain expects. Another way this is often described is the confluence of top-down and bottom-up information. There's information coming into the brain from the bottom up, which means from the senses, from the eyes, the ears, and so on. But also there's information flowing from the top down, from the highest cognitive centers and memory areas down into the sort of the middle ground where the two converge in higher order association cortex and where perception happens. So that's just by way of introduction to this idea, which is that when you're taking hallucinogenic drugs, or so-called psychedelic drugs, what's happening there is that the drug is somehow interfering or altering the way these two streams of information merge in the brain. They tend to sort of tone down or turn or blank out, fade out, reduce in some way the importance of the sensory input, and crank up the importance of the top-down information, what the brain is expecting. And what the brain is expecting is often not conscious. There's a lot going on in your unconscious mind, the unconscious parts of the brain, where expectations are just sort of simmering below your conscious awareness. And those rise up into conscious awareness sometimes when you're taking hallucinogenic or psychedelic drugs. So that's the way I interpret that. And of course, if you're in a situation where you're in a situation of emotional stress, personal crisis, a feeling of helplessness, if you feel the need for help from someone, and especially if you're in a situation where your senses are deprived, where you're not only maybe taking a psychedelic drug, but you may have your eyes closed, or you may be alone, isolated somewhere. Then you're in this kind of separate sensory deprivation environment. That also shifts the balance towards the information flow from the top down. That's when you're very susceptible to this kind of illusion that there's some other being, some other person, some loving presence right next to you that you could reach out to for help. That's what comes to mind.
It reminds me of Joe Rogan always talking about these beings and like every psychedelic trip that they get into. I've done psychedelics, so I know this experience that they're describing, but I've always thought it was a phenomenon, something in the brain. I mean, it's a powerful tool. And anyway, it's a fun, interesting topic. Good question. Constellation Pegasus, I'll drop this once we read it because it covers our faces. I got a temporary English version illustrated learning Bible, and it states the Hebrews thought the sky was a solid dome. That's incredible. You need to do a special in-depth show on Genesis teaching a flat earth and dome cosmology, Derek. My CEV says it's true. I am actually going to be doing a show with Dr. Joshua Bowen, Dr. Kip Davis, and Aaron Adair, who's a scientist as well. And we're going to be picking on Mike Winger, the pastor who is defending the Bible, of course, and talking about this issue. And we're going to show what the ancient Near East actually thought about these things, and how even at times, this is what Aaron Adair said to me in private chat. I know he won't mind me leaking this. There are times in the biblical history of writing where the Greeks already knew better about certain cosmology issues, and the Bible doubled down when they could have gone with the Greeks on a better understanding of the cosmology. So the Bible doubles down on error in many places. So we're gonna help educate the world to see the man-made yet still interesting mythology, legend, history, and all the above mixed into this literature, so people can read it for what it is and not misconstrue it and make people fanatics, as we see happen all too often in America and all across the world. Constellation Pegasus is back again. I would also like to see a special show on dating the solar system and Earth. It irritates me to no end how Christianity can say the Earth and man is 6,000 years old. It's beyond pathetic that can be brought up anymore. Do you know any scientists yourself that might be a good choice that you could connect with me afterwards, maybe help with this? Or
I'm not sure if I'm the best person to connect you with him, but it would be worth looking into a connection with Ken Miller. He's at Brown University.
Ken Miller.
He's a Catholic, by the way. Very interesting person. Still a believer, as far as I know. Every once in a while, I've read a comment from him in something he's written that suggests he may be, a little skeptical of his own beliefs, but he's still a committed Catholic, as far as I know.
Okay.
He wrote a book aimed at his fellow Christians about evolution. And I think it's called something like Finding Darwin's God or something like that. But look up Ken Miller. He has a lot of interesting things to say. And his point, of course, is that I guess what brought him to mind is one of the things he does is he goes through all the evidence for the age of the Earth, because young Earth creationism is a big deal, and he does a lot to shoot that down. And one of the things is to go through all of the geologic as well as biological evidence for the age of the Earth. He's the first person who comes to mind in that regard.
I'd love to.
I have one other thought I could add to that is since we're on this subject. In my first book, I included a little appendix that tries to do the same thing that Ken Miller tries to do.
You're talking about the God's presence one?
Yeah, the illusion of God's presence. I have an appendix at the end of the book, which is it's about evolution. It's my attempt to introduce somebody who's been sort of indoctrinated with the idea of young Earth creationism, and try to just explain to them in a few pages the essence of what evolution really is, because most people who've had that indoctrination have completely crazy ideas about what evolution even says. They don't understand what the scientists say about it. So
Right.
I talk about that in there. And one of the examples I use, one little metaphor I put in there is that there's something special about creation of humans. Nobody pickets school boards to protest the teaching of optics in the explanation of rainbows, right? But there's a biblical passage that explains rainbows. Rainbows come from God's promise never to drown the world again. But for some reason, that doesn't bother the Christians. They don't protest the fact that we teach the optical basis of rainbows in public schools. And the reason they don't is that it's this role of God as our personal creator that really matters to us. That's what really gets our emotions worked up.
Oh, there's something good. I always bring this up because it's kind of like my Bible right now. And it's this book, God and Anatomy, Francesca Stavrakopoulou. She goes in and points out God is corporeal, has a body. In fact, there's multiple chapters devoted to God's penis. And I mean, she is showing you God's nudity, right? Because God likes to flex. The rainbow also is a euphemism, she said, for God's penis in the sky. So anyway, I have to emphasize that because like we can point this out and it won't matter, especially when a Christian's perception philosophically is God is outside space and time and is this mind or being, like totally devoid of the biblical like precedence for this being a God with a body who's just like an enhanced large human, a king, a literal king who sits on a throne, who has a council of other gods, all of that kind of stuff. They kind of ignore it because it's like, well, that's not my God. And then they go into the interpretation, because at that point you can approach the Bible with any kind of model and find a way to bend words to fit your paradigm. Slavery isn't slavery. Oh, it doesn't mean that. And anyway, that's the problem when you get into theology and stuff. But yeah, I appreciate you mentioning that. Constellation Pegasus, physics coupled with information like this stamp out any webs in the back of your head. Science is good for us. You want to comment on this super chat?
Well, what I would say to that is to echo a point you made earlier about how your reliance on belief in God as your savior didn't end up helping you all that much when you were struggling with addiction. But coming to some naturalistic understanding of what addiction is, that it's a medical problem and that maybe talking to a psychiatrist would help, or a psychologist. So far, it actually has helped. And that to me emphasizes a more general point, which is that having a good naturalistic grip, a good scientific grip on reality is good for human flourishing in general. I think individuals do better in their personal lives if they understand and can practice scientific skepticism in just everyday life. It makes you less vulnerable to being scammed by a con artist, for example. And now we see in our nation, at the level of our entire political structure, a serious threat. There are roughly a third of Americans still believe that the 2020 presidential election was stolen. Mm-hmm. Now, whether you're a conservative or a liberal, whether you're a Republican, Democrat, Independent, or anything else, that should frighten you, because that undermines the functioning of the core of American democracy. And the reason so many people, I think, the reason such a large number, tens of millions of Americans still believe this, is that they do not have a strong grip on reality. It's no accident that Donald Trump drew so heavily on white evangelical Christians for his support, that they make up a disproportionate number of his followers and believers. And I think it's no accident. They have been trained. They have been trained not to accept empirical evidence, but to deny it, to ignore it, to believe in the thing unseen. And so I think if they would stop watching Fox News for a little while and listen to other sources, if they would be a little skeptical of their own beliefs, which is a core principle of being a scientist, be skeptical of your own ideas, treat them with the most skepticism. If they could take on some of those ethics, our whole society would work better.
I agree. Thank you for that response. Scott Duke says, yet another fascinating topic. Thanks, Derek. Thank you, Dr. Wathy. I appreciate your time. And Scott, appreciate that super chat.
Thank you very much. I appreciate kind words like that always.
Oh, yeah, you're fantastic. I know we're going to get a lot of people checking this out. Now, hopefully people will leave some comments. I'd like to hear discussion in the chat, even after this live stream. I wonder how many of these elite scientists are aware of the biblical failure of historical and textual examination. How much do they know about it?
I'll try to answer that by reference to Francis Collins. He is an extremely literate person. I have no doubt that he's read the Bible cover to cover. I think he does not take it literally. He knows to take it as at some level as myth that has behind it, in his mind, some important, deep psychological or theological truth. So I think he would probably acknowledge that the Bible is not historically perfect or perfect in any way. It's not historically accurate. So why does he still call himself a Christian? Why does he still read the Bible and take portions of it very seriously? And I would just go back to this interpretation that the illusion is so compelling. The feeling of God's presence has been so compelling for him that he has taken it as evidence for God's existence. And he can't get past that.
That goes into the same one, He Sins Again. Like, I wonder what would happen if these elite scientists read Bart Ehrman's books or yours. I would like to know how much they know about the Bible failure, 6,000-year-old, et cetera, Earth, all of these claims.
Yeah, I agree. I would love to chat with Francis Collins or others of his kind. He's not the only one. My own thesis advisor was a member of the NAS who believed in God. In my book, I give another example of Alistair Hardy, who is a British scientist. He was a member of or a fellow of the Royal Society, very distinguished scientist. And incidentally, one of the professors of Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins was one of his students. And yet he believed in a personal God too, and devoted a lot of his later years to studying this illusion of a sense of presence, which he experienced a lot.
Wow. Okay, we got another one here. Lintutis, did I say that? Lintutis? Forgive me if I butchered the name here. My sister had a car accident. Her religious conviction is based on that. She claimed to have had a vision of the accident before it happened. She claimed to have seen Jesus. What say you about this? Interesting.
Interesting indeed. It's hard for me to know how to interpret that. I can imagine that the brain plays a lot of tricks on somebody who has undergone a physical trauma. One of the most likely things to happen to your brain when you've been in a serious car wreck is that you're knocked unconscious completely. And whether you are or not, you may be. You're going to be in a state of great agitation. Your adrenaline will be flowing. A bunch of stress hormones will be flowing, and you may be going in and out of consciousness, either in the car right after the accident or in the hospital when you're being worked on and you're being given local anesthetics or maybe general anesthetics, or you're coming out of general anesthesia. In these semi-conscious conditions, it's easy to have vague sort of dreamlike states, and it's hard to keep track of what is dream and what is reality. So in those conditions, I could imagine that kind of hallucination happening, and it could easily happen after the fact, well after the accident, but be remembered as happening before the accident. And it's possible that someone was just, especially if they're religious, they may, by coincidence, have been praying and thinking of Jesus before the accident happened, and they kind of reinterpret it as a warning from Jesus that the accident was about to happen. There are many possible natural explanations for things like that. We can never know in any one instance what
Yeah,
really
and that's
happened.
the difficult problem, right? Like your experience, we want to trust our faculties. We want to trust our memory. We want to trust our senses to correctly give us our perceptions of the world around us. And there are interesting studies on like, can we trust our perceptions to, give us accurate information? And how do we methodologically as humans derive at truth that way? And so it's a really fun, interesting discussion. But I'm with you. Like at that point, if someone has this experience, my mom has had tons of these. She interprets these things in ways that kind of like are unfalsifiable. You couldn't explain her out of it, and you kind of have to just throw your hands up and just say, well, there's nothing I can do or say if they're not going to critically hypothesize about what really could be the case, rather than it was this actual vision or experience or a divine, where God actually entered in to do these things. Then there's no way around it. But how do you? And we got another question after this. But how do you? What would you say? I'll say this. What would you say when I am asked by Christians, what would convince you if God was real? And I'm like, well, God would know if God did exist, how to do that. But also you would imagine he would reveal himself in a way that's irrefutable, that isn't, going to be like a trick of my senses. And I mentioned to them, I would want to know if I'm hallucinating. And they go, see, you're already trying to find an excuse out of that experience. Because what if that experience really was God? And I'm like, because people hallucinate. That's why I'd want to know if this is real. But they think that that's a cop-out. What would you say to that?
I would say that people do hallucinate all the time. It happens all the time. And I think Richard Dawkins said this in one place in his book, I've read it from some freethinker anyway, that if they had, it may have been Sam Harris, if you have this compelling vision of Jesus descending from the clouds or Allah or whatever, Vishnu, some God from some religion shows up and in a booming voice proclaims that he is Vishnu and I am the creator and I am the one true God, and here's why you need to start worshiping me and following my rules and doing what I tell you. If I had that in isolation, the most probable explanation of that is that I'm hallucinating. Mm-hmm. Either I dreamed it when I was asleep, or I'm tipping over into schizophrenia and I'm hallucinating for that reason, or I got a bump on the head, or I've got a tumor growing in my visual cortex. Something like that is far more probable than the appearance of this supernatural being. Now, to your question of what would it take, or to the Christian's question of what would it take to convince me that God is real, if that were not a personal hallucination, but something that everyone on earth witnessed, and all of the news channels were reporting it, and there was videotape of it, and this Vishnu God was performing true miracles. One of my favorite miracles that I would love to see a God do is to show up and say, it was not my will that the terrorists destroy the World Trade Center. So I'm going to undo that miraculously, and this will prove to you that I am God. And suddenly, poof, there's the Twin Towers. Everyone who was in it that day and died is in their cubicle, alive and well. The two airplanes are on the ground on a runway somewhere, haven't taken off. All the people in them are alive and healthy. And we can go and interview them and actually tour the Twin Towers ourselves as proof of this miracle. That would get my attention. Scientists all over the world would have to start taking this religion very seriously, have to start taking this God very seriously.
Wow.
But nothing. But so there's a good test that that I can come up with.
Oh, there's probably
Miracles.
so many too you could probably come up with, but yeah.
Yeah. So something like that would get me interested and get me to take it seriously. But I haven't seen anything remotely like that. We don't live in a world of magic. Magic isn't real. There are natural explanations for just about anything that we come in contact with.
Well put. Well put. JC, thank you for that super chat. Where would a patriarchal alpha male god image or filling fit in this neonatal neurobiological hypothesis? Thanks for the thought-provoking presentation. We'll get the books.
Great question. And the answer is fairly simple. The short answer is that it comes from the alpha male patriarchal God comes from the social root of religion. That's the God that most anthropologists and psychologists have studied. There's some great literature on that. One favorite book of mine is called Alpha God, in fact. And another one is called Big Gods. That's a fascinating literature.
So the social aspects is the patriarchal system socially. And this is where the two-faced God point comes up, is like we're borrowing from both to try and make sense of God.
Both sources of intuition are present in our minds at the same time. And these two dimensions of God, these two aspects of God, the loving, nurturing, unconditionally loving, forgiving God, and the dangerous, threatening, judgmental, punishing alpha male God, both of them are there. And it's hard to have a religion that emphasizes only one and eliminates the other, although religions have tried. There's a spiritual belief system that's grown up around a book called The Course in Miracles. Oprah Winfrey is a devotee of this, and it's sort of a new age belief system. I have a friend who's very much a devotee of it. And there they try, the book tries and the followers try to downplay or eliminate this patriarchal, authoritarian, judgmental God. And yet, one group of followers of the Course in Miracles gradually evolved into a cult led by a narcissistic, authoritarian, abusive leader who was himself setting himself up as a judgmental, authoritarian God. So that's one way it can happen. And the other way it can happen is that in a patriarchal, authoritarian religion like Catholicism, that doesn't even allow women in the clergy or in the priesthood, even there, the feminine aspect of God creeps into the religion in subtle ways, even if the patriarchal religious leaders don't want it to happen. And so in Catholicism, we get the veneration of the Virgin Mary as a godlike figure or a goddess-like figure to whom believers pray and turn to for intercession between themselves and the dangerous, threatening, punishing God. So that happens again and again. You get both roots of religion kind of competing against one another, and it's really hard for them to be purged from a religion.
There's so many things about your hypothesis that makes me want to re-examine, like Marcion, right? Who talked about the God of the Jews was evil. This can't be the creator. He says he's the creator of this demiurge, but that the God of Jesus is love. And he saw that dichotomy and he went with the neonatal rather than going with the societies or the tradition of God as well known in scripture. So he has like how he's interpreting theologically all of this is evident that he's going with one side rather than the other. And the Catholic Church is trying to do both and trying to keep both together. But I find this such a fascinating topic that you bring up. Great question, JS. And in fact, I had the same question myself, and you touched on this in previous interviews, but this one you went really deep. So I thank you for that. Continuing with Q&A. Are you cool with continuing?
Sure. If you've got more questions, sure.
Yeah. I have more questions. Cheryl Lyle, thank you for being a member. I appreciate the support. Just joined recently. If you had a face-to-face with William Lane Craig, what would you tell him about his certainty of God and Christianity?
I guess the main point I would make is sort of the one I was making with Francis Collins, which is, okay, if your way of judging truth is these subjective internal feelings, that because you have sensed this presence, what you interpret as the Holy Spirit, if you've personally experienced the presence of the Holy Spirit, and that convinces you, that gives you incontrovertible evidence that God is real, that Christianity, not just God, but Christianity is true. First of all, you're not being scientific. Now, William Lane Craig doesn't pretend to be a scientist. So I would say, okay, you're not being scientific. Be aware of that. You have a different way of discovering what's true. I think your way of discovering what's true is fatally flawed, because people can have hallucinations, people can have illusions, people can be deceived by their own feelings, people can have very, very strong, compelling feelings. For example, the suspicion that their spouse is cheating on them, or conversely, a very strong feeling, an absolutely certain belief that their spouse is faithful to them. And in either case, they could be mistaken. If you want to really know, you base your beliefs on empirical evidence. And if a question cannot be decided by empirical evidence, then what you have to do is just accept that it's an unanswered question and live with that, and do the best you can to answer the questions that can be approached empirically. And for any of these experiences, these feelings, what's really going on is not something that's magical and immaterial. It's neural activity in your brain. It's stuff happening inside your brain. And that is part of the material world. That is part of the purview of science. And that is something that is, at least in principle, explainable in terms of physical processes. And that's what I'm trying to get at in my books.
Thank you so much, Cheryl, for that super chat, and appreciate your answer there. Constellation Pegasus says, how many psychologists believe in God denying evidence against it?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that right off the top of my head. By just from the data I do know, where they polled scientists in general, not by specific subdiscipline, but just in general, that's about 40% on average, which is pretty high. And I, again, think that's because, in large part, because of this illusion of God's presence. The elite scientists, where the number gets really low, down around 5 to 7% of believers, the reason they are elite scientists is that they're very good at questioning their own beliefs. They're very skeptical of their own hypotheses. They want to prove their own ideas wrong, and in their scientific work, they try very hard to do that. And because of that, I think it makes them just more skeptical in general. Now, I had a similar question. You asked about psychologists.
Yeah.
Probably because you may be thinking psychologists understand illusions maybe better than, say, a physicist or a geologist would, because that's the substance of their field. I think that's possible. I think it may turn out that if we did those polls by discipline, that psychologists would be relatively more skeptical of religion than other fields, but I don't know the answer to that. I had the same suspicion about neuroscience, that neuroscientists would be more skeptical of religious ideas and beliefs than scientists on average, but I don't know. I haven't seen a poll like that.
Thank you so much. Unclean Unicorn, thank you so much for the super chat. I've read this book twice. What is the primary complaint you've received from the scientific community?
I have not received any complaints from scientists. So far, the comments have been fairly positive. I'd like to have more feedback from scientists. I get far more non-scientific, or just sort of, non-academic, I should say, more non-academic readers than academic ones. I'm hoping to get more. I'm trying to get my new book that's coming out next month. I'm trying to get that reviewed in scientific journals. Uh, by the way, since you that idea just reminded me of something. My book has been reviewed in a scientific journal. The first book, it was reviewed in I think it's the International Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion, or something like that. The title is something like that. The review was basically positive, but I felt the author kind of missed the point, that maybe the author of the review didn't read it closely enough, because he seemed to be suggesting that I was advocating Freud's ideas at one point in the book, where if you read that chapter closely, you'll see that I'm saying that Freud was basically mistaken in his interpretation. So the one review of my first book that is in a scientific journal, I felt was maybe the reader was not reading it carefully enough. That's kind of all I can say about that.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate that question. Eric Johnson, thank you for the super chat. Great show. What's the biology behind belief in hell?
Yeah, now that I would say is, that again comes from the social root of religion, the other side, the punishing side of God. And the biological, I haven't talked about this really, the biological basis of that has to do with evolution of complexity in human social behavior. We evolved from apes that were at one point, we shared a common ancestor with the chimpanzees and the gorillas. And if you look at chimpanzees and gorillas today, you can see a fairly interesting and complicated social structure in them. It differs among the species. In the gorillas and the chimps, it's a dominance hierarchy with an alpha male at the top. In the bonobos, there's a dominant female at the top. But in both cases, it's a dominance hierarchy. And the belief in hell is really just a specific manifestation of belief in punishment. When a society, when a human society, a human hunter-gatherer tribe, let's say, gets larger and larger, we are dependent on a mechanism for cooperation in which we sort of keep track of who is cooperating, who is contributing to the common good, to the hunt for food, and who is sharing their food, and who is not sharing, who is stealing from the common good, who are the cheaters, who are the cooperators. We have to keep track of that in a hunter-gatherer tribe to enforce fairness and cooperation and keep the society working, keep the group cooperating and working. Now, at some point, if a human culture gets too large, that becomes impractical. There are too many people to keep track of in that way. But there's a trick we can do that gets around that. If we invent a religion where there's an omniscient and omnipotent God who sees what everyone does and who punishes cheaters and rewards people who cooperate, then we don't need to do all this bookkeeping about who's cooperating and who's cheating. Then all we have to do is make sure that people who claim to believe in this God seriously really do believe it. And we can prove that by having this God or the religion demand costly, painful sacrifices as proof of your belief. If you're willing to have the skin of your penis sliced with a dull, knife, then that's pretty good. That's pretty good proof that you're taking the religion seriously. So that's, first of all, where rituals of sacrifice come from in religions. And it's also where this belief in a God of, reward and punishment comes from. And that's the best idea I know of, the best biological idea for how this evolved, how this kind of religiousness serves the evolution of complexity in human social behavior. Now, most societies today are well beyond that. We have other means of, keeping track of people and keeping the society working. We have laws, we have police, we have courts, we have rules. We have all kinds of things to handle it much better now. But at some point there was this transition time where this kind of religiousness was beneficial for our social behavior. That's the biological hypothesis for that.
I really like this question and I love your response. And you can get into the details, of course, like why fire, maybe the region, maybe we get back into that social side. The environment plays a role. They see volcanoes or they see gas pits where fire comes out of the earth. Maybe this is the start of inventing this, maybe in Persia, where Zoroaster and their particular religion of a lava type lake, which influences Second Temple Jews. And then later Christianity, of course. But what also gets me is you can find ice hells in some areas of the world or whatever. So you want to freeze to death? We've got punishment for you. I also, you know of the mentalist Darren Brown. He's an atheist. He's also a magician.
I don't think I've seen him.
I want to give people a plug here. I'm putting it in the comments section. I've mentioned this video before when I did my initial response to William Lane Craig about his lowering the epistemic bar. And if there's 1 in a million chance that Christianity could be true, you should believe it. Like he literally says this. It's almost one of the most revelatory. He says things like this in the past, but he put it all in like a 2-minute package. It was the most amazing confession coming from him on what really, I think, boils down to his epistemic reality of Christianity and how he comes to believe. This video right here, they did an experiment before they ended up having everybody in there come into his studio and explain to them what happened. They're supposed to like take like that, you know, that game you used to play where you dissect the human and it buzzes when you hit the wall and
yes.
You're supposed to be honest. In this case, they're supposed to take this ring and go around this. And if they touch the wall, it buzzes and they're supposed to tap this thing to let the thing know like, hey, I hit the wall. And before the participants came in, they tell them on a certain social group, they tell them that this little chair over there is haunted. And that like supposedly this chair, and he plays it like kind of skeptical. Supposedly this chair, like the person died in it. And then like the house was haunted with this person that's always been in this chair. And they said it's like watching all the time. Then in the other social group, the chair is there, but they never mentioned anything about a ghost. Every single participant in the group that was told, whether they thought it was true or not, it did not matter. They believed that something was watching them subconsciously. And yes. They all were honest. Not a single one of them lied about the buzzer hitting the wall. In the other group, nobody was watching when, mind you, the person left the room. Oh, I got to go to the bathroom. I'll be right back. The other group, 3 out of the 4 lied. And in the group that they thought this chair was haunted, when they left the room, they were honest all the way through. It's worth watching it. I think I posted it in the chat, but it's in the vein of what we're talking about today. So
yeah, very much so. Fascinating.
Yeah, I love those kind of experiments that help us. Scott Duke, do your studies into the brain give you any appreciation for Carl Jung, or was he just engaging in pure speculation?
That's an interesting question. I've read a little bit of Carl Jung. In fact, he had a book specifically about religion. I read that entirely, and I had trouble with him. He seems to contradict himself in places. I had a hard time understanding how much he personally believed in the existence of God after I had read his book about religion. You can find passages in there that will convince you either direction. What I like about Jung's ideas are he's very good, I think, at picking out what he calls archetypes, things that humans seem to easily conjure up images of, or they're sort of patterns of thought or intuitions, maybe is the right word to use for it. Intuitions that humans tend to have that could easily be explained as being innate, being evolved, having a biological root behind them. Although Jung doesn't really do that exactly. He, for example, uses the phrase collective unconscious for these kinds of intuitions that seem to be universal, that all cultures have, these feelings of the kinds of feelings we've been talking about, the kinds of feelings that there must exist some kind of super being out there somewhere. Every culture has some version of that. When he says collective unconscious, you can take that to mean, and some New Age types easily do, take it to mean that our existence as individual, separate conscious minds is an illusion, and that our conscious, what we think of as our ego or our conscious mind, is just a little bubble coming out of some ocean of consciousness, and that this ocean of consciousness is what's real. That's the basis of reality. And consciousness is like a fluid, and there's a universal consciousness, and you can think of that universal consciousness as God, and all of our minds share or tap into this universal consciousness. And the reason that we all have these intuitions about this existence, the existence of this other being, is that we all are getting that from this source. We are all connected to each other through this universal mind. Okay, so you can extrapolate from that. You can go on with that. You can say, okay, well then that would explain psychic powers. That would explain mental telepathy, where all of our minds are connected. We're all actually part of the same mind. So of course we can read each other's thoughts because they are the thoughts of one mind. The problem is that those things don't stand up to empirical testing. They don't stand up to scientific scrutiny. Certainly the psychic communication, the telepathy, that stuff does not hold up well. So if that's how you interpret Jung, then I'm not willing to go there. I don't go that far. But I do think Jung has very good feelings for psyching out human intuitions, the things that the human mind naturally is drawn to and cares about and fixates on.
Thank you for that response. And then thank you for the super sticker, the Canaanite. Really appreciate that support. If there's anything that you feel like you would like to mention about the studies that you did today, if you don't mind, now would be the perfect time to do so while I plug your books for a moment.
Sure. Well, all I would say is that I think my background is in neuroethology, which is it combines the kind of behavioral studies that I talked about early in the book with, the studies of the herring gull pecking at the mother's bill. That's ethology. That's a completely behavioral approach. Neuroethology tries to combine that with studies of the brain. And the first book that I did was mostly an ethological or behavioral approach to religiousness. My second book, which is coming out in October, is mostly a neuro approach, a brain science approach to religiousness. They're kind of two sides of the same coin for someone who did his PhD in a neuroethology lab. But it's important to do the behavioral part first and make sure you sort of understand that as best you can before you start trying to explore what parts of the brain are important in it. So that's kind of the rationale between the two separate books.
Thank you so much. I definitely really appreciate your time today. One thing I realized after all of our presentation is I did not give your bio. So I went right past the bio. John C. Wathy is a retired computational biologist whose interests include evolutionary algorithms, the biology of nervous systems, and electoral reform. He got his PhD in neurosciences at UC San Diego and has spent most of his career working on computer simulations of protein folding. His first book, of course, The Illusion of God's Presence, explores the evolution of the emotions and intuitions behind religious belief, emphasizing behavioral and psychological research. His latest book is The Phantom God, What Neuroscience Reveals About the Compulsion to Believe. It relates the motivating forces behind religiousness to the neurocircuitry. Am I saying that right?
Circuitry
of embodiment, mother-infant attachment, adult sexual pair bonding, addiction, which I can't wait to talk about with you, selective attention, hallucinations, and many other neurological surprises. So I should have mentioned this at the front end. My apologies for not going into that with everything on my plate. But I'm interested in two aspects of what you described, of course, in that latter book. And obviously the addiction part, but also the sexual part. Because I think it's something we all want, most of us, and it's like taboo to discuss. But it's so important. The struggles that I went through from addiction to drugs and alcohol, I equate my addiction to Jesus. And I mean that. Like I was addicted to the religion. I was a fanatic, a nutcase.
Yeah.
I'm saying it, don't take offense, but I'm saying it about myself because I know the kind of harassment that my family had to endure through my religious, just obsessive about it. Any conversation always turned into Jesus this and Jesus that. And it was just crazy. So I look forward to that with you. Did you want to comment on that before I show any other plugs?
Only that there's a lot to say about it, more than we're going to have time for in another hour-long session. But the two things you just mentioned, addiction and sexuality, are closely tied together. They're two sides of the same coin. There's a lot of neural circuitry behind both of them. By which I mean there's a part of the brain that handles that kind of compulsive behavior, whether it's drinking, eating, mating, or I think believing in God. I think there's an obvious connection, an experimentally documented connection to this special part of the brain. We'll get to that next time, though.
It might make sense why all of these religions have funny ways of either promoting sex or fighting against it, and
or both.
Or both, yeah.
Yeah, they're very conflicted about it. Yeah,
it's interesting, and that's why I love reading and learning the things I am critically as I analyze the Bible and other ancient literatures. It's almost like a fossil into our evolutionary stage psychologically and culturally. We get to actually examine the way we thought and how we handled these issues as evolved, rising apes, if that makes sense. So,
yeah.
Couple more questions. People don't want to see you leave yet, Dr. Wathy. Hate to ask this late, but what's going on with the electric motors in cells?
I am guessing that this question refers to, I'm not sure, you correct me if I'm wrong. I'm guessing this refers to the creationist argument that there's a molecular motor, a flagellum that powers a bacterium, and that this is something that can only be explained by intelligent design. It's been debunked, refuted. I don't know if that's exactly what this questioner is referring to, though.
If it is, would you recommend or refer them to something? Or
I believe this is correct. I think Ken Miller is one of the people who debunks this. You could probably find that in Ken Miller's book, but you can Google it. There's a website called talkorigins.org. They also debunk creationist arguments. I'm pretty sure you could find it there too. There's a lot of moving parts in cells, though. The question is a fascinating question, even if that's not what he's asking about. He could easily be asking about a whole bunch of other things. There are lots of moving parts in biological cells, some more than others. Neurons have these long fibers that carry electrical signals through the brain. And they also, in those fibers, need to transport molecules just to do the housekeeping, to keep the long fiber alive, because it's part of a living cell. So there's nutrients and waste products and enzymes being transported up and down the fiber. And there's a system of microtubules that, acts like a conveyor belt, shuttling molecules back and forth through these tiny, tiny little fibers. So there's a lot of moving parts, and they are motors in a sense.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I want to do more with you. I want to do a lot more with you. In fact, Cheryl, thank you for the super chat. Derek, please have Dr. Wathi on more often. The biblical scholars are great, but this was illuminating. I want to start balancing that out. I plan on getting more pertaining to evolution on the channel. Tomorrow, I'm having a scientist, Dr. Aaron Adair, come on. And, this question of science and religion are completely separate. He wants to address this. He's an atheist scientist as well. He worked at CERN, or still does. I can't remember. But he's like, I want to address this issue and how science has allowed me to investigate religious claims and getting into the Bible. And like, he took an approach because he's big into knowing like astronomy, he knows cosmology really well from an actual scientific stance. And he's debunked the whole Star of Bethlehem and Jesus's birth, and like he can go into all of that. His entire book's about it. So I hope that people will stick around, and I want you to come back more often, not just to plug the books. I'm sure we can do other presentations that are related to your field that encourage people to purchase these books, to educate. And that's a way of supporting scholars. So if you appreciate what you heard today, go get his books. Highly recommend. You can pre-order, I think, right, on the Phantom God?
Yes, you can pre-order that book today, yes.
Excellent.
It comes out October 15th, I believe.
So it's right around the corner. Go ahead and pre-order it now, so you'll be one of the first people to get it. And we will be doing a show, we can obviously launch a show immediately when this is out, or we can do one leading up to it. It's up to you, Dr. Wathi, what you prefer. But I really want to get people to wrap their heads around this, because this is what made me feel freedom, not feeling any burden, understanding the natural world that is what it is. We have to live with it. But thank you so much for that. Your website, wathiresearch.com. Go check out the website. Is the blog something we could sign up for?
The blog is just occasional articles that I write. I'm not a prolific blogger. Every once in a while, when something moves me, I'll post something there. But I write something maybe once every 6 months or so, but they're a little different. They're not all about religion. So, they'll show you some of my other thoughts on other subjects.
Excellent. Go check out his website. Also consider joining MythVision's Patreon. I'm making a trip actually later this week. If you want to help mitigate the traveling cost, I do have a GoFundMe there. I'm going to interview Paula Fredrickson, and she's a New Testament academic when it comes to Jesus studies. And I'm going to interview in person, 4K quality, high camera gear, the whole nine. So check out the MythVision Patreon. All that content will be early released there and then leaked out onto the YouTube world as time goes by. So you can sign up for as little as like $3 a month, and you can buy the whole year up for 16% discount. It tells you the math. Go check it out. I also have the course on ancient Greek mysteries. Again, I said at the intro of this episode, early bird cost right now. There's 7 lecture course series here on the ancient Greek mysteries. And the final one we discuss is Christianity and the mystery cults, if you will, the mysteries. So there's a lot of language in Christianity that seems to be lifted from the zeitgeist, the milieu of the first century with other Greek mystery cults. And you got to ask yourself, why does Jesus look like Dionysus? Why is he called the true vine in the Gospel of John? That was a title given to Dionysus. The Bacchic mysteries. Why is he healing just like Asclepius? What's going on with this Jesus guy? Is this coming from the worldview of the other ancient Roman and Greek deities? Something to consider. I also have a bunch on Bart Ehrman, and that is down in the description as well. One of my favorites was the Genesis one, but all of them are great. Consider joining our membership program as well. I have to give you the last word, though, Dr. Wathi, because I always do a plug to let people know who are new watching our channel here that there are ways you can help us, and you can learn a lot more. I have hundreds of videos on Patreon, for example, that I've never made public that they can join. But tell us, any final words from you?
I just want to say thank you for doing everything you're doing, putting these podcasts on. I told you earlier that I watched one where you were telling your deconversion story, and it was It was truly inspiring. I always admire people who have found their way out of religion and who are trying to make sense of it. So just thank you for doing that. And thanks for inviting me.
Thank you. You had the words that explain the phenomena I'm trying to describe subjectively the best I could. I was trying to be objective about that subjective experience that I was going through, and your work is right there in the vein of what I'm discussing in my deconversion and my religious experiences. So I thank you actually for coming and joining me, and let's do this again.
Definitely. We will do it again. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you. Don't forget to like this video, everybody, or that, God might punish you because, he's watching all of us. And if you don't hit the like, you know what will happen. We don't want that to happen, do we? Dr. Wathi, thank you so much. Never forget, ladies and gentlemen, we are Myth Vision.